It began before anyone noticed the light, before the sirens, before the headlines. On a wet March morning in 2003, the Maynard Gallery in Manchester stood open, its doors unlocked, its corridors glowing faintly, like a theater that had forgotten to end the performance. Inside, silence pressed against the marble floors, and a single painting hung crooked, the last witness to whatever had happened hours before. By dawn, one man was missing, and what he left behind would stop the investigation cold. Detective Inspector Louise Harland was the first through the door, called from her flat, half-dressed, rain still on her coat. The message from dispatch had been routine: possible break-in at the Maynard Gallery. Night guard unresponsive. But the moment she stepped inside, she knew this wasn't a burglary. It felt orchestrated. The night guard lay face down by the west entrance. No blood, no visible injury. Just a faint, chemical sting of something acrid in the air. Paint thinner, maybe, or something meant to smell like it. Every security camera had been cut. Every door manually unlocked. Whoever had done this knew the building better than the staff. Then Harland turned toward the east wall and froze. There beneath the pale spotlight was a blank rectangle. The placard beneath it read, "Portrait of Eliza Harrow, 1879. Artist unknown." The frame was gone. The wall was cold. And on the gallery floor, faint but unmistakable, was a single footprint in red pigment. The missing painting wasn't valuable, not by auction standards. But the woman in it had eyes that didn't belong to the century she was painted in. And what no one yet knew was this: the man who vanished that night had written his name weeks earlier on the back of the canvas. Because this wasn't just theft. It was something far stranger, and the first clue lay hidden in the paint itself. The piece wasn't famous. It wasn't insured for much. To most, it was just another forgotten portrait in a gallery known more for local heritage than masterpieces. But Harland would later learn that the thief hadn't chosen at random. That painting was the key to a secret buried for nearly a century, and it would stop the investigation dead in its tracks. Before we go further, what do you think makes someone risk everything for a painting? Is it greed, obsession, or guilt? Drop your theory in the comments, because what happened next will test all three. The investigation began like any other. Harland's team sealed the building, dusted for prints, cataloged every footprint, every trace of disturbed dust. But what unsettled her most was the precision. Whoever had taken the painting knew exactly where to go, how long they had, and which systems to bypass. The break-in wasn't loud or rushed. It was almost surgical. The only evidence left behind was a single boot print in the dust near the back door. Size 9, worn heel, partially smeared, but distinct enough for the lab to confirm it wasn't the guard's. There was also a scrap of linen caught on a nail by the door frame. Faded, hand-woven, the kind of fabric you'd find on restoration canvases from the late 19th century. To most, it was meaningless. To Harland, it was a whisper. Whoever took the painting had handled it before, and maybe not in this century. The Maynard Gallery wasn't new to theft. Over the decades, it had lost and recovered its share of minor works. But this felt different. There was no forced entry, no smashed glass or tripped alarms. The thief had known the guard's routine, the security rotation, even the building's blind spots. When Harland interviewed the curator, an anxious man named Simon Pratt, she noticed something off about him. His hand shook when he mentioned the portrait. He claimed the painting had no real provenance. Donated anonymously sometime in the 1950s, rediscovered in a storage loft 10 years later. It's never been cataloged properly, he said. There's not much to say. Just an old family piece, I suppose. But there was more in his eyes, a flicker of fear. Not for the theft itself, but for what might now come to light. Forensics confirmed the guard had died from cardiac arrest, but the pathologist noted a strange residue in his bloodstream, a trace compound found in certain restoration solvents. It wasn't enough to kill on its own, but combined with stress, fear, or prior heart trouble, it could have pushed him over the edge. In other words, the thief hadn't meant to kill him. The guard had died of fright. Still, one question burned in Harland's mind. Why this painting? It wasn't until 2 days later that she got her first lead. A CCTV camera 3 streets away, one not connected to the gallery system, captured a figure at 2:14 a.m., pushing a long, narrow case into the back of a white delivery van. The registration plate was partially obscured, but the first 3 letters were visible: MJL. A database search returned dozens of results, but one name stood out: Michael James Latham, an independent art restorer, former employee of the Maynard Gallery. Fired in 1998 for professional misconduct, Harland didn't hesitate. She sent a team to Latham's address in Ancoats. But when they arrived, the flat was empty. The furniture covered in sheets, the fridge unplugged. Latham hadn't lived there for months. On the kitchen counter, though, was a single object, a photograph. It showed the missing portrait, only this version was different. In the original, Eliza Harrow's eyes were a soft gray, her expression serene. But in the photograph, her face was partially obscured, as though the paint had been stripped away to reveal something beneath. Something darker. And in the corner of the photo, just visible through the peeling layers of pigment, was another face. Male, smiling faintly. The image haunted Harland. She took it to the lab, had it enhanced, analyzed. Experts debated what it could be: an underpainting, perhaps, or a double exposure from restoration. But when the digital render came through, they all went quiet. The second face wasn't random brushwork. It was deliberate, and it matched a known historical figure: Edwin Harrow, the husband of the woman in the portrait. The official story said Edwin died in 1880, a year after the portrait was painted. But records from that time were thin, and rumors suggested otherwise. In the archives of the Manchester Courier, Harland found an obituary dated May 12, 1880. It listed Edwin Harrow as deceased following a carriage accident on the Oldham Road. But what struck her wasn't the obituary itself. It was the accompanying notice published 1 day later. Notice to creditors and associates. The estate of Mr. Edwin Harrow, late of Stretford, is hereby frozen pending legal inquiry into matters of misappropriation and fraud. Fraud. So the husband wasn't just a tragic loss. He was under investigation, and the wife, the serene Eliza, had commissioned her portrait at the very moment his empire was crumbling. The deeper Harland dug, the stranger got. Buried in the city records, she discovered that the Harrow estate had owned several textile mills across Manchester in the late Victorian period. One of them, the Ormond Mill, had burned down in 1879, the same year the portrait was painted. Dozens of workers were trapped inside. It was ruled an accident, but letters between Eliza and her husband hinted otherwise. Letters the gallery archives had held all along. You said it would all be over soon, Eliza wrote in one. That the fire would cleanse us of what we'd done. But I see their faces when I close my eyes. You've cursed us both. Those letters have been donated with the painting, tucked behind its frame, unread for decades. Someone had known. Someone had seen the truth inside the painting and wanted it hidden. Harland's next move was risky. She ordered the gallery archives sealed and authorized a re-examination of all donor records from the 1950s. That's when she noticed a familiar name. The painting had been gifted anonymously, yes, but the delivery slip was signed by hand, using initials: MJL. Michael James Latham, the same name that had appeared on the van. The problem? Latham wasn't born until 1972. So either someone else had used those initials, or the same name had reappeared across generations, tied to a single artifact. A quiet chill settled over the investigation. Days passed, leads dried up, the tabloids moved on. Gallery heist linked to mystery portrait made the front page for a week, then faded beneath stories of football transfers and council scandals. But Harland couldn't let it go. Every night she stared at the enhanced image, that second face, half buried in paint, smirking through the years. She reached out to an art historian at the University of Manchester, Professor Alan Meredith, who specialized in hidden layers of oil paintings. When he examined the photograph, he frowned. "This isn't an underpainting," he said. "It's a palimpsest," a word Harland hadn't heard since school. He explained, "A palimpsest is when a surface is reused Its original image scraped away, painted over but never completely gone. Over time, traces reemerge. "So someone painted over another portrait?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Yes, but not just another portrait. The texture here, see these brush marks? It's like two hands worked this canvas, decades apart." He pointed to the grainy outline of the male face. Whoever uncovered this wasn't just restoring. They were reversing history. That night, Harland went back to the gallery alone. The walls were bare now, save for the faint outline where the painting had hung. She stood in the quiet, the kind that hums behind old stone walls, and she thought about the thief. Why steal something that wasn't valuable? Why kill for it, even accidentally? Unless the value wasn't in the art, but in the secret beneath it. And then, something small caught her eye. In the far corner of the gallery floor, where the technicians had vacuumed days before, a sliver of glass glinted under her torchlight. She crouched down. It wasn't glass at all. It was a fragment of varnish, curved and brittle, the kind used to seal antique oil paintings. Only, embedded in its surface was a single hair. She sent it for analysis immediately. The results came back the next morning. The DNA matched no one in the national database. But the profile was male, and the sample carried traces of linseed oil and calcium carbonate, both common in paint restoration work. So the thief wasn't a random criminal. He was a professional, and likely an artist himself. 2 weeks later, Harland received an anonymous envelope at the station. No return address. Inside, a folded piece of heavy parchment, torn from an old ledger. Across the top, Ormond Mill, 1879, restorations and accounts. And beneath that, a list of names, workers, suppliers, tradesmen. One entry stood out. Monsieur Gilles Latam, apprentice carpenter. It couldn't be. A century apart, the same name appeared again. Harland's hands shook as she flipped the page. Scrawled in pencil at the bottom was a line that made her blood run cold. He knew what was beneath the paint. He promised to hide her forever. By the time she looked up from the page, she knew what she had to do. The painting wasn't just stolen, it was being taken back. And whoever had it now wasn't running from the police. They were running from history itself. The morning after the envelope arrived, Detective Inspector Harland sat alone in her car outside the gallery. The city was waking, buses hissing past, shop shutters clattering open. But inside her head, the world was utterly still. That single line from the ledger had gnawed at her all night. He knew what was beneath the paint. He promised to hide her forever. Who was he? Who was her? And what did any of it have to do with a restorer named Michael Latham, alive in 2003, and an apprentice carpenter with the same name in 1879? There was no rational answer. But something about the symmetry, the pattern across generations, refused to let her go. Back at the station, the lab confirmed the ledger paper was authentic. It dated from 1879, the exact year of the Ormond Mill fire. The ink, the fiber composition, even the watermarks were consistent with the period. So whoever sent it had access to genuine historical documents. That meant one of two things: a collector or someone with access to private archives. And that led her back to Simon Pratt, the curator. When she arrived at the gallery that afternoon, she found Pratt pacing in his office, chain-smoking despite the no-smoking sign taped to his door. He looked older than before, paler, thinner, like someone haunted by a memory he didn't want to face. "I told you everything I know," he said. Harland dropped the ledger page on his desk. "You didn't tell me this existed." He froze. Then, very quietly, he said, "Where did you get that?" "It came to me in the post." "No sender." "You want to explain why this ledger lists a man named Latham working for the Harrows in 1879? Pratt didn't answer. His eyes darted to the office door, then back to her. "You shouldn't have that," he whispered. "It's not supposed to exist anymore." "Why?" He exhaled, the smoke curling between them. "Because the Harrow family paid very good money to make sure it didn't." Over the next hour, the story began to unravel, a thread stretching back more than a century. According to Pratt, the Harrow family's fortune had been built not only on textiles but on restoration commissions, a polite way of saying forgery. The elder Edwin Harrow had hired artisans to reproduce works of art for wealthy clients who wanted originals but couldn't afford them. One of those artisans was a young man named Matthew James Latham, an orphan trained as a woodcarver. He was gifted, meticulous, and quickly became Edwin's most trusted craftsman. But when the Ormond Mill fire destroyed part of Harrow's collection, something darker began. Rumors claimed that Latham had been ordered to restore damaged paintings, not by repairing them, but by painting over people who no longer existed. Servants, workers, mistresses, the forgotten faces of Manchester's underbelly. It was said that Eliza Harrow herself had sat for him, demanding that her portrait conceal everything that came before. But the painter had refused. He'd left something behind, something that was never meant to be seen. By now, Harland's world felt split in two, the rational and the impossible. She wanted to believe this was just an elaborate story, a myth built from guilt and rumor. But when she traced the last registered descendant of the Harrow family, she found a name that hit like electricity. Margaret Latham Harrow, a hyphenated heir, born 1932, died 1998. Childless, executor of both estates. And guess who had inherited her personal effects? Michael James Latham, her great-nephew. The same man now missing with the painting. Harland called for a nationwide alert, but Latham's van hadn't resurfaced anywhere. His bank accounts were dormant, his phone inactive. Then, 3 days later, CCTV picked him up again, this time on a rural road outside Buxton. The van pulled into a derelict farmhouse at 2:47 a.m. Harland led the raid personally. When they entered the property, they found the van abandoned, the keys still in the ignition. Inside the farmhouse was a single light, an oil lamp burning low beside an easel. And on that easel, facing the wall, was the missing painting. She turned it slowly. The canvas was half-stripped, the top layer of paint peeled away in sheets. Beneath the image of Eliza Harrow, another face was emerging, the faint, ghostly outline of a child. The girl's eyes were open. Her mouth, half-formed in the strokes, seemed to whisper. And beneath her image, faint but visible in the scraping marks, was a name etched into the primer: Ruth. In that moment, everything changed. Harland ordered the scene photographed, cataloged, sealed. Forensics began their slow work, but she couldn't look away from that face. Ruth, a name that had appeared nowhere in the archives, no birth records, no death certificates. So who was she? The answer came, as always, in fragments. Hidden inside a false drawer in the farmhouse desk was a notebook, Latham's, dated sporadically over several years. The handwriting was careful, elegant, and deeply personal. She was there beneath the varnish, a child bound in oil and linen. I thought it was damage, smoke stain, age, but it was her. Someone painted over her. Someone wanted her forgotten. I dream of her face now. Sometimes when I mix the pigment, I see her reflection. The paint remembers. It always remembers. My great-aunt told me never to touch the portrait. She said it belonged to the dead. I thought she meant sentiment. Now I think she meant something else entirely. When Harland finished reading, she looked up at the painting again. For a second, just a second, she thought she saw the girl's eyes shift in the lamplight. She told herself it was fatigue. Still, when she reached out to touch the edge of the canvas, her hand hesitated. The surface felt warm. In the weeks that followed, the painting was taken to a secure conservation lab. Layer by layer, experts began removing the later varnishes and overpaint. Each layer told a story, not just of age, but of deliberate concealment. Under the outer portrait of Eliza Harrow lay a composition depicting a child, possibly 9 or 10 years old, standing beside a loom. The background matched sketches of the Ormond Mill interior. In the paint matrix, trace analysis revealed something horrifying: carbonized fibers of human origin. Hair, forensics confirmed. The pigment used in that layer contained organic material consistent with burned human remains. The artist hadn't merely painted a memorial. He had painted with what was left of her. When Harland confronted Pratt with the findings, the man broke. He confessed that the gallery had known for decades the painting was unusual. There had been restoration attempts in the 1970s, One technician had claimed to see faces in the primer, then resigned immediately. But the Harrow Trust, the same foundation funding the gallery, had buried the report. The painting stayed on the wall, admired but ignored, its secret sealed under layers of shellac and silence. Until Michael Latham returned to finish what his ancestor had started. He wasn't stealing art for money. He was exhuming the truth. The revelation tore through Manchester's art community. Scholars called it a moral catastrophe. Forensic historians labeled it the first known instance of anthropogenic pigment in post-industrial British art. But for Harland, none of that mattered. What mattered was finding Latham. A month after the farmhouse discovery, she finally did. He was found in an abandoned chapel on the outskirts of Stockport, sitting quietly beneath a tarp-covered window. Around him were open jars of paint, brushes, and a single candle burned almost to the wick. When Harland entered, he didn't move. "You found her," he said softly. She nodded. "Who was she?" He smiled, a sad, distant thing. "You wouldn't believe me. Try me." He turned his gaze to the wall, where a rough sketch of a child's outline glowed faintly in the half-light. "My family kept her secret for 100 years, he said. "She wasn't supposed to exist, but she did. They made her disappear the only way they knew how, into the art. The mills burned, the bodies lost. And my ancestor, the painter, he couldn't save her. So he buried her in his work. Why steal the painting?" Harland asked. "I didn't steal it," he said. "I freed it." They took him into custody without resistance. In his interview, Latham remained calm, lucid, even articulate. He spoke of dreams where the girl appeared, standing in smoke, asking to be seen. He claimed he'd traced his ancestry, found the old ledger, and realized that every generation of his family had been involved, not in crime, but in penance. "Every Latham since Matthew has worked with paint, restoration, craft," he said. "We've all tried to wash her away, but the paint remembers. The canvas remembers." I just listened. When Harland asked where the rest of the painting was, the missing fragments, the peeled sections found in his farmhouse, he said something she would never forget. "They're back where she died, in the ground that burned her." Search teams combed the site of the former Ormond Mill, now a council estate. Beneath the old foundation, they found remains, charred fragments of bone, textile fibers, and a child's shoe buckle. Carbon dating placed them in the late 19th century. DNA extraction was impossible. The evidence had long since turned to dust. But for the record, one thing stood: a piece of cloth still intact, matching the original canvas weave. The story hit the press hard, but in strange ways. The tabloids called Latham the painter of bones. The broadsheets spoke of art, sin, and redemption. The Maynard Gallery closed temporarily, citing security reasons. Yet no charges stuck. Latham had broken no theft laws. He was, in fact, the rightful owner of the painting through inheritance. The guard's death was ruled natural causes. The only crime left was one too old to prosecute. For Harland, the case felt unfinished. She spent weeks after the inquest wandering the empty halls of the gallery, now stripped of its exhibits. In the basement, she found a portrait again, restored catalog but sealed behind glass, labeled simply, "Untitled, circa 1879. Artist unknown." The girl's face was faint now, almost gone, but under certain light, her eyes still caught the reflection. The case file closed quietly. No one wanted to dwell on what it implied, that history could lie beneath our feet, beneath our art, even beneath our names. But Harland couldn't let go. One night, months later, she returned to the gallery after hours. She told herself she was only checking on security. But standing before that glass case, she felt the same warmth she had in the farmhouse. A low hum filled the air, the kind you hear just before thunder. And there, in the reflection of the glass, two figures stood. Eliza Harrow, and beside her, the child. Both watching, both waiting. Harland blinked. They were gone. But when she stepped closer, she saw something new. A line of text, barely visible, scratched into the paint beneath the title card. "Memory is the truest portrait of all." Years later, when Harland retired, she took one file with her, the Latham dossier. It remained unsolved in spirit, even if the facts were clear. What she'd come to understand was this. Some crimes don't die. They just sink deeper, layer upon layer, until time itself forgets them. And sometimes it takes a thief, not a killer, not a liar, but a thief to bring the truth back into the light. Because in the end, that's what Michael Latham had been. Not a criminal, an excavator of memory. A man who saw, in paint and silence, the one thing history always tries to bury, the human face. This was Trace Crime Files. Subscribe for more stories where truth is stranger than fiction, and justice is never as simple as it seems.